So first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here to help honor all of Bala's achievements. I'll tell you that as an experimenter, I knew the names of Bala Iyer and Luc Blanchet from the post-Newtonian parameters and their calculations, because that was very important to some of the experiments I was doing decades ago. So I'm going to tell you about the LIGO-Perspective on LIGO-India. And in the LIGO laboratory, we date the beginning of LIGO-India as April 19th, 2012. That's the day of the order from the National Science Foundation to cease installation of the H2 interferometer, which was the basic focus of installation, and to begin putting the parts in storage for an eventual detector in LIGO-India. And it's also the beginning of when India knew that it had to build up the experimental manpower and not only in experimental physics, but engineering and everything to be ready to execute LIGO-India. Other things would take time, like site acquisition, getting big amounts of construction money, but building the human infrastructure could begin immediately. And so what I'm going to talk about, I was assigned the topic of the challenges, and this is a quote I often tell young people, is that opportunity lives in the home of risk. And we in LIGO keep things called risk registers. And so I'm going to go through that. But first, I just wanted to give you a perspective of some of the things that I personally attribute to the successes that LIGO has, which I encourage our colleagues in India to try to emulate. And the first is what I call it one team, many mail codes. Okay, the advanced LIGO detector was built with zero recognition of whether people were at Caltech or at MIT. It never showed up in any of the paperwork. There was one purchasing system. We used the Caltech purchasing system. Peter Fritschel at MIT, if he needed to commit $1 million in purchases, had the authority to do it. We worked those out. And on every single detail, there were people from both institutions and also occasionally an outside institution doing subcontracted work who were working this, but they were all part of one team. And that's a very important concept because you need the agility of one team to pull off something this big. It implies very high person-to-person communication rates. People have to talk many times a day with their colleagues on what they're working on, and it has to be high quality communication. It includes sharing things like how's it going, what keeps you up awake at night, I screwed up, how do we fix this problem I made? Things like that that have to get done, not, oh, everything's fine, and you know, it's not like you're asking for directions when you're driving in India, okay? And it also needs frequent and vigorous reviews of sub-projects by the diverse stakeholders across those many mail codes. So that's a very important concept. The other that's important is distributed decision-making, and it has to be as close to the work and as fast as possible. Now, there are different cultures and different styles in which you can achieve a set of requirements, but usually the requirements come about because of a set of numbers. And so just to give you a couple of numbers, LIGO operations and maintenance spends $123,000 a day, $5.1 thousand an hour, okay? So when a problem comes up, when a contractor gets stuck, you don't have time for deep thought. and contemplation. You have to solve the problem immediately. And that means you have to be aware of the hundreds of chess pieces that are being manipulated and what the schedules are and what the consequences are of rearranging those chess pieces. And you have to think a move or two ahead. To try to help us do that, every project, we try to assign a cognizant engineer and a cognizant scientist to the project. This is along the lines of how B-reactor, the first plutonium production reactor, was built in 13 months during World War II, is you really need, and literally they sat in the same room at the B-reactor site, people doing those sorts of things. That is how the major projects of initial LIGO and advanced LIGO got done. And what the management does is it doesn't interfere. It sets clear requirements, clear rules of engagement, the constraints, and then it hands down authority and responsibility, but it provides accountability. So monthly reporting on progress against plan. And those were essential elements of getting LIGO built. So now we move on to risks. I have to, every year, give a talk to the NSF assessing the risks of the LIGO-India program to the overall LIGO mission, okay? Which is somewhat different from the perspective that people in the India scientific establishment might have. And we perceive the primary risks to be a couple of existential risks. One, and this talk was from January, one was failure to acquire the observatory site. That one is actually retired, but now almost retired, was from June. Insufficient training of the LIGO-India staff is, I believe, still an existential risk. In 7.5 years, I think India has built pessimistically 5%, optimistically 10% of the capacity that it needs. So we're on track for getting the human capacity to build this right in about a century. Okay, so I'll just quote a saying we often say in the US, if you always do what you did, you'll always get what you got. Okay? Secondary risks, one more, logistics problems. We could damage components of the detector irreparably, and so we would like to begin as soon as we can to actually move the detector components to India as soon as India is ready to receive them. I won't go through a lot of the secondary risks, except one big one is the flow of money. And whoops, wrong button. One big one is the release of the money to really move forward. So I think we're now in a situation where in the near term, we're money limited, right? We have to let those big contracts so DCSEM can start moving Earth on the site. And so we're hoping that this is about a month out. It's gone about 2 of the 3 steps. We threw in an extra election just to slow things down a little bit, but now that's in the hands of the cabinet, and we hope to get a good outcome in about a month. I won't go through all the rest of these for lack of time. You can read them on your own. But one of the problems to realize is India's challenge is to be relevant, it has to hit a moving target, okay? So you have 2013 to 2015 technology in those storage cans at Hanford, okay? There were significant modifications made to get it ready for the 01 run, significant modifications for 02. There will be significant, and 03, there will be significant modifications for 04, and there will be A+ going online before LIGO-India goes online. So there, as of this point in 03, there are well over 300 engineering change orders. Major changes to the detector hardware. You need that detector hardware to make the changes to. but those all have to get done. So there's a non-linearity to delays. The more you delay, the more the rest of the world turns, the more work you have to do just to catch up. By 2025, scientifically, you also have to see the cost of delays. There are a quantity of about 1,000 binary black holes will have been detected by then, and roughly 100 BNS detections. So that physics will be very, very mature, and India will have missed out playing an important role in that. Okay, I'll remind you that with 3 detectors, you get very good localization over only half the sky. The other half of the sky is pretty crummy localization. So you really need a 4th detector to come on for those things. So these are all very important. There'll still be plenty of physics to do, but there's a high cost to it. What we assess for LIGO is what's the overall impact on the physics that LIGO produces. We will still have 2 detectors. That's our priority, is to make sure our 2 detectors are detecting those, and then hopefully bring the 3rd LIGO-India detector online when we can. So let's talk about the staffing that's needed. To meet the demands of multi-messenger astronomy, we have to realize there's not just the staff to operate the site and strategies of how many sites you need. This was all worried about back in the 1980s when we were writing the proposal to build LIGO. But we now serve a much larger and much more demanding community. Okay, so it's not just the gravity wave community. The gravity wave community in the world is only about half of the stakeholders in the LIGO era, because LIGO now really rocks astronomy. So we're starting to fill those roles, but the big challenge for LIGO in the US is to be timely, right? The astronomers have to coordinate proposals for the next 6 months of observing time with when you're running and things like that. And so when you're a month late, it has big consequences for people. So the demands and the size of the stakeholder community are growing all the time. So again, the staffing requirements are determined by numbers. There's a need to have people physically on the site to be able to respond to issues that compromise observing time in a time scale of minutes to hours. Then you need an on-call capacity that's local enough to be able to respond within an hour. And then you can have, and you will need a remote capacity to carry on the support tasks. And those include research, engineering development, procurement, and all of those things. And those people have to be able to travel to the site, but you can wait till people get on an airplane or take a very long car ride. So I give the figures here for the layout of, in this particular case, the remote operations. And so you can see there's an engineering group, a lab computing group that concerns itself with the overall data analysis infrastructures similar to the IUCA system that you're building. There is also groups that handle all the business of providing network services, laptop services, ability to have multiple people working on scheduling and programming at the same time and being visible to each other. There's a science group that is there to do whatever science, but you'll see it's one little corner off to the side of all the manpower that's needed to run things. And then there are the infrastructures, the 40-meter lab, the LASTE facility. There'll be an RRCAT test and training facility. Those all have to get operated, and then there are special projects, for instance, like LIGO-India. So you have to have capacity for that. And on site, this is sort of the immediate capacity that you need. And I won't go through all the different groups, but they're separated into, you have to maintain buildings, you have to maintain vacuum systems, detectors, you need detector engineers on site, you have a science team, commissioners, et cetera. and a very important and very general purpose group of people who are operators, the people who actually are the first line of defense when the observatory has problems. So to put the numbers in context, it takes about 40 people in that immediate response category to be living on, within an hour of the site. And the backup capability in LIGO is about, it's about 80 people, of which probably 70 are technical people. Actually, if you put it between Caltech and MIT, it's closer to 90, of which about 75 are technical. So those are the rough numbers. Now, when I talk to my colleagues at NCRA, they say, their way of figuring out how you man a radio facility is you figure out what it takes in the US or Europe and you multiply by 2.5. I don't understand the 2.5. At least some of that is the chaiwalas and people people who maintain the guest house and stuff like that. So, but in any event, those are the absolute requirements. You can't lean it down much more than that. So you're looking at needing something on the order of, hundreds of people that you have to be highly skilled. You also need to worry about the transition from construction to an operating facility, which doesn't happen like it does at ISRO, where, they count down to 0, and then, you're in operations mode once the satellite deploys. It doesn't work that way, that you turn over in a day. The first time the construction project delivers a piece of equipment, and typically it takes some years to deliver the equipment, the first thing that arrives needs somebody to receive it, check the quality, and now maintain it. And so there's a ramp down in construction and a ramp up in operations that has to get figured out, okay? And because the deliverables increase over time, you have to match your hiring of people into the operations phase with the right skills for the right equipment as it arrives in time. And so all of this has to get charted out. And it's a lot of moving parts. Typically, it's about 15,000 lines of schedule to maintain and move the chess pieces around. And then careful planning is needed to match the hiring, obviously, to that. So just to give you some need by dates, if you want to be observing in 2025, and I think we've already given that up, right? We might be ready to say when we're going to start observing by the end of 2025, but it looks like we're slipping into 2026. You can start to count backwards and figure out that by this year or next year, you need the operations director hired on staff. And I'll tell you a little story about the authority of the operations director has to happen. Ray got his Nobel Prize for the discovery of GW 150914 because the laboratory director at Livingston told Ray that under no circumstances was he allowed to touch the electronics the Friday before the Monday that this happened. To make it worse, Ray was Joe Giammi's thesis advisor, okay, who was frantic in his office about, there was some RF pickup and we couldn't possibly launch this into a run. And Joe had to say, no, Ray, it operates pretty good. We told the world we're running in a week, and you may not go and touch the electronics out on the floor. Figure out something to do in your office, okay? And Ray would have gotten a Nobel Prize eventually, but getting it for that event was due to Joe Giammi telling him to get lost. Okay, so that's the level of authority an operations director needs to have. Yeah, this is my last slide. I don't want to hang on what the problems are. I want to hang on what the opportunities are. So from the viewpoint of LIGO Lab, The LIGO global network of Hanford, Livingston, and LIGO-India operating under a single technical management, coordinating its upgrades, et cetera, should be the premier facilities in the ground network over the period from 2025 to at least 2035, or later if there are delays in bringing on, Cosmic Explorer and Einstein Telescope. And they should provide the most sensitive data with the strongest contributions to localization polarization, which is often underrated, but I think is extremely important for cosmology. Of all the observatories in the network, we'll still need Virgo and Kagra to contribute, but we expect those to be the most sensitive and the most impactful. Also, due to their common facilities designs, all three observatories have the potential to support detectors far more sensitive. So the Voyager class of detectors should be able to go far beyond A+ in sensitivity during that period of time. And we have that project or upgrade path being implemented. Rana spends about 2 months a year in India encouraging people at various universities to work on technology towards that. We expect that because of the increases in detection rate, it's still time that the vast majority of gravitational wave sources will still be discovered using the LIGO and, incorporating LIGO-India. So even though the time is late, there's still a lot of detections out in the future. So that's the optimistic note I want to leave with.
Thanks, Fred. I think what we'll do is we'll take questions on this in the panel discussion later on, because